The air in Hawthorn Hall's grand salon was thick with the scent of impending rain, wilting rose petals, and the collective self-satisfaction of the Chalmsbury Rose and Fuchsia Society. It was an atmosphere that promised, at any moment, to curdle into a headache. The annual gala was reaching its zenith, that precarious point in the afternoon between the awarding of the silver-plated Rose Bowl and the gradual, reluctant departure for evening meals, Lady Eleanor Beaumont, whose late husband had not only owned the hall but had also, it was generally agreed, perfected the art of looking disappointed in a waistcoat, stood as the unassailable centre of this floral universe. Around her neck, resting on the formidable shelf of her bosom, lay the crimson locket. It was not in truth particularly crimson. Generations of Beaumont fingers had polished its enamel to a colour more akin to a fading sunset or a well-boiled lobster. Its value was not in carats, but in continuity. It signified that whatever else was happening in the world, a Beaumont was still in charge of the roses. Mr. Alastair Finch, the town clerk, hovered near her, his smile fixed with the determined brightness of a man trying to sell a damp property. "A triumph, Lady Eleanor," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over the trestle tables laden with drooping blooms. "An absolute triumph. The competitive spirit this year has been robust." "The competitive spirit, Mr. Finch," Lady Eleanor corrected, her voice a low, resonant hum, "is what separates horticulture from mere gardening. It is what separates us," she added with a slight, all-encompassing gesture, "from them." Who they were was never specified, but everyone present understood the sentiment perfectly. It was precisely at this moment of peak respectability that Mrs. Millicent Higgins began her fateful journey across the parquet floor. Mrs. Higgins was a nervous woman whose social ambitions consistently outpaced her physical coordination. Entrusted by the catering committee with a tray of sherry, she navigated the crowded salon like a small, unseaworthy vessel in a churning sea of tweed and floral prints. Her target was Major Eustace Blundell, who was holding forth on the lamentable weakness of modern aphids. Her trajectory, however, was fatally miscalculated. A slight, perhaps unavoidable, jostle from a counsellor's elbow was all it took. The tray tilted. Time seemed to slow, as it often does in moments of pure, unadulterated social horror. A half-dozen sherry glasses, glinting in the pale afternoon light, slid in unison towards the edge. Mr. Finch saw it coming. His smile didn't falter, but a small muscle in his jaw twitched with the frantic speed of a telegraph key. Lady Eleanor, turning to address him, found her view obscured by a cascade of amber liquid and shattering glass. The sound was not so much a crash as a wet, expensive scrunch. The sherry, a particularly sticky Amontillado, soaked instantly into the hem of Lady Eleanor's skirt. A single errant tumbler ricocheted off the stout tweed of Major Blundell's jacket before landing with a soft thud on the carpet. "Oh!" cried Mrs. Higgins, her face draining of all colour. "Oh, my heavens! Oh, Lady Eleanor, I am so dreadfully, dreadfully sorry." A circle of silence formed around them, a vacuum of etiquette into which no one dared step. The Major grunted, dabbing at his jacket with a handkerchief. Mr. Finch, his smile now a grimace of heroic civic duty, produced his own. "A minor spill, Lady Eleanor." "Nothing to be concerned about." "These things happen." "Indeed," Lady Eleanor said, her voice dangerously calm. She surveyed the damage to her dress with the air of a monarch inspecting a failed colony. She dabbed futilely at the stain. Then, with a gesture of weary finality, her hand went to her throat, a familiar, comforting motion to touch the locket. Her fingers found only the high collar of her dress. She frowned. Her hand moved again, tracing the line of her clavicle. Her expression shifted from irritation to mild confusion, and then to a stark, chilling stillness. The polite murmurs and offers of assistance died on the air. "My locket," Lady Eleanor announced to the silent room. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with absolute authority. It has vanished. Mr. Finch's world, which was constructed primarily of avoiding scenes, suddenly collapsed. Vanished? He repeated, as if the word were a foreign delicacy he was unsure how to consume. But it must have simply come unclasped. It's here, on the floor, but it was not on the floor. A frantic, yet discreet, search of the immediate vicinity revealed nothing but damp carpet, a few rogue canapé crumbs, and the shards of Mrs. Higgins's social aspirations. The crimson locket was gone. The afternoon, which had been merely wilting, had now officially soured. The robust competitive spirit had evaporated, replaced by something far more unsettling, a shared, unspoken suspicion. Every eye in the room subtly, almost unconsciously, flickered towards the weeping figure of Mrs. Millicent Higgins. It was the Major, a man accustomed to taking charge, who made the inevitable, dreadful suggestion. "This is a matter," he boomed, with a funereal solemnity, "for the police." 10 minutes later, a functional, unassuming Ford motor car crunched to a halt on the gravel drive of Hawthorn Hall. Inspector Pubright stepped out, his raincoat draped over his arm despite the lack of rain. He took a moment to survey the grand, slightly sad-looking building and the anxious faces peering from its windows. He did not hurry. He observed the scene with the mild, patient interest of a man who knew that trouble, like tea, was best approached when it had been given a moment to stew. News in a town like Chalmsbury did not travel. It seeped. It possessed the invasive quality of damp, starting in one corner of the civic structure and spreading silently until the whole was saturated. The source of the contagion on this particular afternoon was Mrs. Pringle of the catering committee, who, having witnessed the sherry incident and its immediate, appalling aftermath, felt a sudden and pressing need for a cup of Earl Grey and a sympathetic ear. She fled Hawthorn Hall with the haste of a refugee, her duty to the remaining cucumber sandwiches entirely forgotten. She found her sanctuary, as many did, in the warm, scone-scented air of the Windflower Tea Room. Here, under the benevolent gaze of a watercolour painting of the market square, the town's nervous system resided. It was a place where reputations could be starched, stained, or shredded entirely over a pot of tea for two. "My dear, you will not believe the scene," Mrs. Pringle began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper to her friend, Mrs. Gable, who was an expert in the art of looking shocked. Poor Millicent Higgins absolutely lost her footing. A whole tray of Amontillado right down the front of Lady Beaumont's dress. And then the locket gone. Mrs. Gable processed this information, her mind working with the swift efficiency of a master weaver. An accident? Plausible. A spillage? Commonplace. But a valuable object vanishing at the exact same moment? That was not happenstance. That was narrative. A diversion, Mrs. Gable pronounced, nodding sagely as she passed the news to Miss Thrip on the adjacent table. Millicent Higgins, bless her clumsy heart, created a diversion. And in the confusion, some opportunist must have simply snatched it, Miss Thrip, whose hearing was less a sense and more a finely tuned surveillance instrument, absorbed the word snatched. It was a good, solid, criminal sort of word. When she paid her bill at the counter, she felt it her civic duty to inform the proprietor. A dreadful business up at the hall, apparently. That Mrs. Higgins caused a scene and Lady Beaumont's locket was snatched right from her neck. The crimson locket, you know. The one with the rubies. There were, in fact, no rubies. The locket's primary components were enamel, sentiment, and a sliver of gold plate, but the addition of gems gave the story a satisfying heft. By the time the tale had crossed the room, percolating through the tables of the solicitor's wife and the bank manager's sister, it had acquired not only rubies, but a diamond clasp and an estimated value that could have financed a modest municipal project. The final, definitive version of the story was crystallized by 4 o'clock. It held that Millicent Higgins, driven to desperation by her husband's failing hardware business, had purposefully flung a tray of drinks at Lady Eleanor as a cover to tear the priceless heirloom from her throat. It was, all agreed, a shocking display of moral decay, and entirely what one might expect from a woman who had once worn beige shoes to the Remembrance Day service. The entire town knew it for a fact, long before Inspector Pubright had even finished his preliminary survey of the damp patch on Hawthorn Hall's carpet. Back in the Grand Salon, the atmosphere was one of profound social constipation. Guests lingered in awkward clumps, unsure whether it was more impolite to stay or to leave. Sergeant Love, a young man who believed firmly in procedure and notebooks, was attempting to take a statement from Major Blundell, who spoke as if dictating a field report on a failed military campaign. Pubright, meanwhile, ignored them all. He stood by a window overlooking the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back, seemingly absorbed by the sight of a groundsman methodically deadheading a row of defeated-looking roses. He allowed the silence in the room to do its work, to let the initial flurry of shock and accusation settle like dust. He had learned long ago that people's second thoughts were invariably more interesting than their first. After several long minutes, he turned his attention away from the window. His gaze passed over Lady Eleanor, who was now seated and accepting condolences as if recently bereaved, and Mr. Finch, who was attempting to look reassuring and funereal simultaneously. It settled instead upon the trembling, forgotten figure of Mrs. Millicent Higgins, who was sitting on a small gilded chair in the corner, quietly shredding a paper napkin into a mound of miserable confetti. Pubright approached her, his footsteps making no sound on the thick rug. "Mrs. Higgins," he said, his voice quiet and entirely devoid of judgment. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to tell me about the sherry." The question, gentle as it was, landed on Mrs. Higgins with the force of a physical blow. She looked up at Inspector Pubright, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed disproportionate to an inquiry about sherry. For a moment she seemed incapable of speech, her mouth opening and closing silently. The little pile of shredded napkin in her lap was a testament to the frantic industry of her nerves. "The sherry," she finally whispered, as if the word itself were an obscenity. "It was for Major Blundell. He has such a terribly dry throat, he always says. I was just navigating. The floor is so very polished. And there were so many people." She trailed off, her gaze darting around the room as if the guilty party might still be lurking behind a potted fern. "Were you jostled, Mrs. Higgins?" Pubright asked, his tone that of a man asking for directions. I believe so, yes. It all happened so terribly fast. A bump. Just a little bump to my arm. The tray simply flew from my hands, she demonstrated with a weak, fluttering gesture. And the crash. And Lady Eleanor. Her composure disintegrated entirely, and she dissolved into a fresh wave of quiet, hopeless sobs. Pubright did not press her. He merely nodded, a gesture of placid acceptance, before turning to Mr. Finch, who had been hovering with the anxious energy of a host whose prize possession has just been sick on the rug. "Perhaps," the inspector suggested, "there is a quieter room where we might continue." The town clerk, grateful for a task, led them with funereal reverence to a small study off the main hall. It was a room that smelled of old leather and furniture polish, a place designed for sober reflection and the signing of important documents. Here, away from the accusing silence of the Grand Salon, Mr. Finch offered his own account. It was a model of clarity and contained nothing of value. "A most unfortunate confluence of events, Inspector," he stated, standing ramrod straight by the fireplace. "The room was at capacity. Mrs. Higgins, while well-intentioned, is perhaps not the most spatially aware individual." She turned, another guest moved, and the laws of physics did the rest. "A simple accident, so you saw nothing untoward?" Pubright inquired. "No specific bump or push?" "I saw a crowd behaving as a crowd does," Mr. Finch corrected smoothly. "An economy of movement becomes impossible. One is buffeted by the general tide. To single out one particular nudge would be pure speculation." His tone implied that speculation was a vulgar habit, like smoking indoors. He was a man who dealt in minutes and memorandums, not in the messy chaos of human interaction. His testimony was a public record, scrubbed clean of any incriminating detail. Their final interview in the little study was with Lady Eleanor herself. She had composed herself, her grief now cooled into a hard, aristocratic anger. She sat in a high-backed chair, her posture suggesting that she was holding court rather than assisting a police inquiry. Sergeant Love, poised with his notebook, seemed to shrink slightly under her gaze. "The locket, Inspector," she began, preempting any question, "was a gift from my grandmother on her wedding day. It has been in the Beaumont family since the reign of Queen Anne. Its value is not something that can be expressed in fiscal terms." "Of course, my lady," Pubright said. "Can you describe the moment of the incident?" "It was less an incident than an assault," she replied coolly. "One is talking, and the next moment one is deluged with cheap sherry. In the ensuing chaos, the locket was taken. You are certain it was taken?" "And did not perhaps fall?" Lady Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "The clasp was an Italian patent, exceedingly robust. It would not fall. It was taken from my person. I felt a tugging sensation at my neck, a brief, sharp pull amidst the commotion of that woman, spilling her tray. Pubright absorbed this. A bump, a general buffeting. A sharp, deliberate pull. 3 people, standing within feet of each other, had provided 3 entirely separate accounts of a single moment in time. He knew that truth did not lie in choosing the most plausible version, but in understanding why the versions were different. "Thank you, Lady Eleanor. You have been most helpful." When she had swept from the room, leaving a faint scent of lavender and indignation in her wake, Sergeant Love finally looked up from his notebook. He sighed, a sound of profound procedural frustration. "Well, that clears it all up, sir," he said, with the heavy irony of a young officer who likes his facts to be solid and sequential. According to the witnesses, the locket was either lost in an accidental spill, stolen by a phantom in a crowd, or ripped from her neck by a sherry-wielding assailant. "We have nothing." Inspector Pubright walked back to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn, where the last of the guests were now making their hurried, gossiping escapes. "On the contrary, Sergeant," he murmured, more to himself than to his subordinate. "We have a great deal. We have a panic, a policy, and a performance. The question is, which one is attempting to conceal the fact?" As the Ford eased its way down the long gravel drive of Hawthorn Hall, Sergeant Love clicked his ballpoint pen with an air of decision. "Right, sir. A panic, a policy, and a performance. The panic is Mrs. Higgins. The policy is Mr. Finch wanting it all kept quiet. The performance is Lady Eleanor acting as if the crown jewels were pinched." "I suggest we start with the panic." "A person doesn't get into that state over a bit of spilled sherry." Pubright offered a non-committal grunt, his eyes on the road. "Routine background inquiries are never a bad idea, Sergeant." Routine in Chalmsbury was a remarkably efficient process. It required no computers and very little paperwork. It merely required a quiet word with Constable Oates, who spent his off-duty hours tending an allotment next to a man who delivered paraffin to the Higginses' part of town. By late afternoon, the background was common knowledge at the station. Higgins's hardware, once a bastion of screws, brackets, and sensible advice, was, to use the technical term, on its last legs. A new, larger chain store on the high street was strangling it with special offers and brightly coloured signage. Rumour was that Mr. Higgins hadn't been able to pay his suppliers for 2 months. This news was received by the town's unofficial governing body with a quiet, collective sigh of relief. It was a motive, and a motive, particularly a financial one, was a wonderfully tidy thing. It explained everything. Mr. Alastair Finch telephoned the inspector just before 5 o'clock. "Just calling to see if you require any further assistance from the council, Inspector," he began, his voice oozing with civic responsibility. A terribly sad business, of course, especially when one hears of the difficult circumstances some people are facing. One has to feel for them. Desperate times, I suppose. He did not need to say the name. The implication was clear. The matter involved a desperate woman from the lower rungs of the town's social ladder, and therefore need not trouble the more important rungs any further. Pubright listened patiently. "Our inquiries are ongoing, Mr. Finch." Of course. "Well, do let me know if we can expedite anything." The reputation of the gala is paramount. The final, perfect piece of the puzzle was provided by Sergeant Love an hour later. Acting on a hunch born of years spent dealing with petty theft, he had made a discreet telephone call to the manager of the Chalmsbury Savings and Loan. "You're not going to believe this, sir," he said, his voice alight with the thrill of a case slotting neatly into place. "Mrs. Millicent Higgins. She walked into the bank at 10 o'clock this morning, paid £20 in cash into her account. First deposit she's made in over a month. £20. It was not the price of a priceless heirloom, but it was precisely the sort of sum one might receive from a discreet pawnbroker for a small, unflashy piece of gold-plated enamel. They found Mrs. Higgins at home, in a small, meticulously clean house that smelled faintly of beeswax and worry. She was sitting at her kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of tea. Her husband, a man with the slumped shoulders of perpetual defeat, sat opposite her. The news of the police visit had evidently preceded them. Pubright did not bother with pleasantries. He approached the matter with a directness that was, in its own way, a form of kindness. "Mrs. Higgins," he said, his voice gentle, "we've been made aware that you deposited £20 in your bank account this morning. Could you tell me where that money came from?" The effect was instantaneous. If she had been panicked at the Hall, she was now utterly petrified. The colour drained from her face, leaving it a blotchy white. £20? She stammered, looking wildly at her husband, who simply stared at the tabletop. "Oh, I sold some things." "Some old crockery." "At the antiques shop? Which antiques shop would that be?" Sergeant Love asked, his pen poised. "The one by the bridge," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Chalmsbury Antiques, it was a poor lie. Pubright knew for a fact that the proprietor of Chalmsbury Antiques had been in Bournemouth for a week visiting his sister. "I see," the inspector said. He looked around the small, proud kitchen. He noted the carefully darned tablecloth, the row of polished copper pans, the single, perfect rose in a jam jar on the windowsill. It seemed to him a room curated by a person who valued order and dignity above all else, a person who would be terrified of the shame of a hardware shop failing, a person who would be utterly destroyed by a public accusation of theft. As they walked back to the car, Love closed his notebook with a snap of satisfaction. "Well, that's that then. Motive, opportunity, and a lie about the money. It doesn't get much tidier." Pubright nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the Higginses' front door. "Tidy," he agreed, the word sounding strangely hollow. "Almost too tidy, wouldn't you say?" Sergeant Love arrived at the station the next morning with a neatly typed preliminary report that all but convicted Mrs. Higgins on grounds of financial desperation and poor lying. He expected a commendation. Instead, he found Inspector Pubright staring out the window, a cup of tea untouched on his desk. "I think," Pubright said, without turning, "we should pay another visit to Hawthorn Hall." Love blinked. "To the Hall, sir? I thought we were going to have another chat with Mrs. Higgins. Formal caution, perhaps." "All in good time, Sergeant," Pubright murmured. "I feel we may have been distracted by the people. I'd like to have another look at the room." The grand salon at Hawthorn Hall was a profoundly melancholy place on a Sunday morning. The glamour of the previous day had evaporated, leaving behind a faint, cloying scent of decay. Most of the glasses and plates had been cleared, but the flower displays remained on the trestle tables, a sad gallery of wilting champions. A cleaner was half-heartedly sweeping the parquet floor, her movements slow and resentful, while Sergeant Love, with a sigh of dutiful resignation, began taking formal measurements of the distance from the sherry table to the point of impact. Pubright simply wondered. He was not looking for clues in the conventional sense. He was absorbing the space, trying to read the echoes of the previous day's agitation. He stood where Lady Eleanor had stood, then moved to the spot from which Mr. Finch had observed the proceedings. He traced the clumsy, panicked trajectory of Mrs. Higgins's final steps. Nothing. The room was inert, its secret swept away with the sherry-soaked shards of glass. His slow perambulation eventually brought him to the prize exhibits. He inspected the winning fuchsias, their delicate heads now drooping in surrender. He admired the sheer, belligerent size of the prize-winning marrow. And then he came to the winner of the coveted, silver-plated rose bowl, the entry for Best Rose Display. A small, immaculately lettered card identified the grower as a Mr. Silas Abernathy. The display was, even in its current state of gentle decline, a masterpiece of the form. A dozen stems of a rose called White Perfection, each one a flawless sculpture of creamy petals arranged in a simple crystal vase. It was a study in pure, unblemished elegance. It was the sort of display that required not just skill, but a fanatical devotion to order. And yet, it was not perfect. Tucked low at the back of the vase, almost entirely concealed by the spray of fern that formed the base, was something that did not belong. It was a single, cheerful, almost idiotic-looking marigold. Its brash, common orange was a jarring insult to the aristocratic white of the roses. It was not a stray petal. It had a stem. It had been placed there, deliberately. Pubright stared at it for a full minute. To any other observer, it was a piece of litter, a stray bloom dropped by a careless guest. But to Pubright, it was an act of profound and inexplicable contradiction. A man capable of cultivating 12 flawless white roses was not a man who would tolerate the presence of a vulgar orange marigold. It was like finding a smear of ketchup on a royal decree. "Find anything, sir?" Sergeant Love asked, approaching with his tape measure. Pubright did not look up from the vase. "Tell me, Love," he said quietly. "What do you know of this Mr. Abernathy?" Love shrugged. "Not much. Keeps to himself. Lives in one of the old railway cottages. His garden is famous, but he never comes to the pub. They say he's a bit of a recluse. Why?" Pubright reached into the display with 2 careful fingers and gently extracted the offending marigold. He held it up to the pale morning light. "Because," he said, more to himself than to his sergeant, "I find myself wondering why a man obsessed with perfection would deliberately spoil his own masterpiece." Love peered at the flower. "Maybe a kid dropped it in for a laugh, sir. Or it fell from someone's buttonhole, perhaps," Pubright said, his expression unreadable. He placed the marigold carefully into a small evidence bag he took from his pocket, an act of such gravity that it seemed to elevate the humble flower to an object of immense significance. The case against Millicent Higgins, so solid and tidy just an hour before, had suddenly developed a hairline crack. It was a crack that no one else could see, but for Pubright, it was enough to let the doubt shine through. Sergeant Love drove back to the station in a state of mild bewilderment, the evidence bag containing the single marigold resting on the seat between them like an unexploded bomb. His mind was still firmly on Mrs. Higgins and her flimsy alibi. The inspector's mind, it was clear, had moved on. "Sergeant," Pubright said as they pulled up outside the station, "I would be most grateful if you could construct a biography for me. Of Mr. Silas Abernathy. I am interested in his professional history, particularly any past employment within the parish." Abernathy, the gardener. "Right you are, sir," Love said, his tone suggesting he thought it a colossal waste of time. While his subordinate went off to consult the dusty archives of local memory and council records, Pubright decided to pursue his own, more delicate line of inquiry. He knew that to understand the significance of a perfect rose display, one first had to understand the society that judged it. This led him to the small cluttered cottage of Miss Elspeth Petherbridge, who had served as the honorary secretary of the Charmsbury Rose and Future Society for 27 thankless years. Miss Petherbridge was a woman desiccated by minutes and agendas, but her memory for slights and snubs was perfectly preserved. After Pubright had politely admired her collection of commemorative royal teacups, she was happy to talk. "Oh, the gala was a success, Inspector, in its way," she said, pouring a weak cup of tea. "Though the tensions were running rather high this year, as you can imagine." Pubright stirred his tea. "Tensions?" "The presidency, of course," she sighed. "It's always the presidency. Lady Eleanor believes the position is hers by divine right, a sort of floral peerage passed down from her late husband. Beatrice Blundell, the Major's wife, feels that her 20 years of actually organising the seed catalogues and chasing membership fees should count for something. She made a motion at the last AGM to have the presidency put to a vote. Well, you would have thought she'd suggested turning Hawthorn Hall into a bingo hall. Lady Eleanor simply fixed her with that look of hers and said, "Some things, Beatrice, are not for voting on." The motion was not seconded. Pubright took a sip of tea. "A long-standing disagreement, then?" "It is a silent, vicious war, Inspector, fought with passive-aggressive comments about floral arrangements and the strategic misplacing of name cards at the annual dinner. Last year, Beatrice's prize-winning delphiniums were mysteriously moved behind a curtain just before the judging. The year before, Lady Eleanor's speech was inexplicably shortened in the programme to welcoming remarks. "It is a battle of 1,000 tiny cuts." Pubright filed this information away. A room containing two such determined rivals was a room ripe for incident. An embarrassment for Lady Eleanor, such as the public loss of a treasured heirloom, would be a considerable victory for Mrs. Blundell. He returned to the station to find Sergeant Love looking unusually animated. The younger officer had a sheaf of notes in his hand. "Got something on Abernathy, sir?" "Something interesting. Took some digging. Spoke to old Mr. Cobbold, who was on the parish council for 50 years. Our prize-winning gardener isn't just some recluse who happens to be good with flowers." Love paused for dramatic effect. Up until 15 years ago, Silas Abernathy was the head groundskeeper at Hawthorn Hall. Purbright's expression did not change, but a quiet stillness came over him. Was he indeed? And why did he leave such a prestigious position? "He was dismissed," Love said, tapping his notes. "Sacked by the late Lord Beaumont himself. Apparently there was a blight on the estate's prize-winning roses, the very same white perfection breed he won with yesterday. Lord Beaumont accused Abernathy of negligence. Abernathy, who by all accounts was a proud and brilliant gardener, insisted it was a fungal infection beyond his control. There was a terrible row. Lord Beaumont was a man of formidable temper. He called Abernathy incompetent in front of the entire staff. Fired him on the spot. Abernathy packed his bags and was gone the same day." "And Lady Eleanor?" Pubright asked softly. "She was there, sir. According to Mr. Cobbold, she stood right beside her husband and told Abernathy he'd brought shame on the Beaumont name. He hasn't set foot on the grounds of Hawthorn Hall since." "Until yesterday." Sergeant Love leaned back in his chair, immensely pleased with himself. They now had a second and far more compelling suspect, a man with a deep 15-year-old grudge, publicly humiliated by the very woman whose locket had just vanished. Pubright looked from Love's triumphant face to the small, wilting marigold still resting in its evidence bag on his desk. The tidy conclusion of the previous day had dissolved completely. In its place was a murky, unpleasant conglomeration of grievances. He was no longer investigating a simple theft. He was excavating the layered resentments of the Chalmsbury elite, the bitter rivalry of two proud women, and the cold, patient fury of a wronged man. The locket had not simply vanished into thin air. It had fallen into a viper's nest. Monday morning brought with it the thin, respectable drizzle that Chalmsbury used to wash its face for the week ahead. At his desk, Inspector Pubright had arranged 3 separate sheets of paper. On the first, he had written Millicent Higgins, motive, desperation. On the second, Beatrice Blundell, motive, ambition. On the third, Silas Abernathy, motive, revenge. Each motive was plausible, human, and entirely self-contained. The problem, as Pubright saw it, was that they could not all be true, yet none of them felt entirely false. The case was waterlogged with possibilities. He was staring at this frustrating triptych of human failing when the telephone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the quiet station. It was, of course, Mr. Alastair Finch. His voice, usually a smooth and polished instrument of civic bureaucracy, was strained to the point of cracking. "Inspector Pubright? Alastair Finch here. I do apologize for bothering you on a Monday morning, but we appear to have a situation. A second absence, you might say. The town clerk's office was a shrine to order. Files were arranged alphabetically and chronologically. Pens stood to attention in a ceramic pot. A single, unadorned calendar hung on the wall. It was the office of a man who believed that if you controlled the paperwork, you controlled the world. Today, however, that control had been violated. On a gleaming mahogany credenza between a framed photograph of the mayor and a silver letter opener was an empty circle in the dust. "It sat right there," Mr. Finch said, pointing a trembling finger. "I saw it myself on Saturday morning before I left for the hall, the silver-plated rose bowl, polished and ready for the engravers. I came in not half an hour ago and it's gone." Pubright inspected the empty space with mild interest. Sergeant Love, notebook at the ready, adopted his official crime scene posture. "Was the office locked over the weekend, sir?" "Of course it was locked," Finch snapped, then visibly reined himself in. "My apologies. Yes, the main council doors are locked on Sunday, but my own office door was secured as usual when I left on Saturday afternoon. There is no sign of forced entry. The window latch is undisturbed. It has simply ceased to be here." The trophy itself, Pubright soon established, was an object of immense sentimental and negligible material value. It was a large, rather ornate bowl, its silver plating worn thin in several places from decades of enthusiastic polishing. Its chief feature was the densely packed list of names engraved upon its surface, a roll call of Chalmsbury's horticultural champions dating back to 1922. Its scrap value, Pubright estimated, would barely cover the cost of a decent lunch. "This is a disaster," Finch was muttering, pacing the length of his office. "An absolute administrative catastrophe. The trophy belongs to the society. It is merely held in trust by the council. Who knew it was here?" Pubright asked, his voice cutting calmly through the clerk's panic. "The committee, of course. Lady Eleanor, the Major and Mrs. Blundell. They were all here on Saturday morning for a final briefing before the gala. The office was unlocked. People were in and out, collecting name badges, finalizing the seating plan. And the winner of the trophy this year was Mr. Silas Abernathy," Pubright stated, not as a question. Finch stopped pacing. Yes, his name was to be the next one on the list. A remarkable achievement considering his history with the Hall. The implications of this new theft settled slowly and heavily in the quiet office. A desperate woman in need of cash would have no use for a silver-plated bowl. Mrs. Higgins's already flimsy candidacy for the role of town master thief now seemed utterly preposterous. This second act was not born of need. It was, like the marigold in the vase of roses, an act of pure, pointed symbolism. Someone had not only wanted to embarrass Lady Eleanor, but had also wanted to erase Silas Abernathy's triumph before it could be permanently etched into the town's history. As they left the council offices and stepped back out into the persistent drizzle, Sergeant Love shook his head in frustration. "This makes no sense, sir. First, a valuable locket, now a worthless trophy. The case is getting muddier by the minute. What are we supposed to be looking for? A thief, a vandal, a practical joker?" Pubright turned up the collar of his raincoat. He seemed, to Love's astonishment, almost cheerful. The gloom of the case and the weather had not touched him at all. "Don't you see, Sergeant?" he said, a glint of genuine enthusiasm in his eyes. "It's perfectly logical. We have been labouring under the misapprehension that the crime was theft. This proves it is nothing of the sort." "Then what is it, sir?" "It's a form of communication," Pubright replied, looking towards the market square. "Someone in Chalmsbury is trying to edit the official narrative, and people only do that when they feel the story, as it stands, has done them a grave injustice." That evening, Inspector Pubright sat in his usual corner at the Shepherd's Crook with a pint of mild. The pub was a place of comforting predictability. Old Mr. Hemlock was nursing a stout and complaining about the weather. The landlord was polishing the same glass he had polished the night before. The clock on the wall was, as ever, 7 minutes slow. It was the rhythm of the town, the steady, unassuming beat that lay beneath the frantic treble of gossip and scandal. It was here that Pubright did his best thinking, precisely because the atmosphere demanded none. His thoughts returned to his own words to Sergeant Love. Someone was trying to edit the official narrative. Chalmsbury, he reflected, was a town built on such narratives. There was the story of the benevolent Beaumonts at the Hall, patrons of the town's culture. There was the story of the efficient and modernizing council, guided by the steady hand of Alistair Finch. There was the story of the Rose and Future Society, a genteel battlefield where the town's leading ladies fought their bloodless wars. These were the agreed-upon fictions that allowed everyone to rub along together with a minimum of fuss. The events of the last 2 days were not mere crimes. They were acts of aggressive proofreading, committed by someone with a red pen and a deep-seated grievance. Someone was shouting in the quietest possible way that the story was wrong. He considered the candidates for this anonymous editor. He set aside Millicent Higgins. Her story was not one of grievance, but of pure, undiluted terror. She was a woman drowning in social anxiety, whose every action since the spillage had been dictated by a desperate fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. Her clumsy lie about the £20 was not the mark of a thief, but of a person so ashamed of her husband's financial troubles that she would invent a fiction rather than admit the truth, that the money was from the sale of her own mother's modest jewellery, a final secret sacrifice to keep the wolves from the door. She was a victim of the narrative, not its author. Then there was Beatrice Blundell. Her grievance was plain enough: the perennial runner-up, the competent organiser forever in the shadow of the hereditary president. An embarrassing incident for Lady Eleanor. Certainly that would be to Mrs. Blundell's advantage. Pubright could easily imagine her with a cool head and a steady hand, creating a subtle opportunity in the crush. But the second act, the theft of the Rose Bowl, did not quite fit. It was too chaotic, too broad a target. It was an attack on the society itself, the very institution she sought to command. Beatrice Blundell, Pubright suspected, was a creature of political manoeuvre, not symbolic vandalism. His thoughts, inevitably, settled on the quiet gardener in the old railway cottage, Silas Abernathy. Here, the grievance was not a matter of social standing, but of fundamental injustice. A man's career, his name, his pride, all sacrificed on the altar of a late lord's temper and a dying rose bush. For 15 years, Abernathy had lived with that narrative, the man who had failed the Beaumonts. And then, after a decade and a half of patient silence, he had returned to the scene of his humiliation and proven, beyond all doubt, that he was the finest gardener in Chalmsbury. His victory was not just an award. It was a complete and total refutation of the lie that had defined his life. So why, Pubright wondered, swirling the last of his beer, would a man steal the very object that represented his vindication? Why go to the trouble of winning only to erase the result? It was an act of supreme self-sabotage, unless, of course, it wasn't. Perhaps winning was the point, and the trophy itself was an irrelevance. Perhaps the victory was meant only for an audience of one, Lady Eleanor Beaumont. Perhaps taking the trophy was a final, contemptuous gesture, a way of saying, "I do not need your trinkets. My victory was in proving you wrong, and that is enough." Pubright drained his glass. The habits of people, he mused, were so often dictated by the wounds they carried. Some wounds made people lash out, others made them shrink. But the deepest wounds, the ones that festered for years, often led to the most peculiar and contradictory behavior. He had a clear picture now, not of a criminal, but of a mindset. A mind that was proud, patient, and deeply hurt. A mind that would respond to a direct accusation with a wall of angry denial, but might, just might, be prompted to reveal itself by a carefully placed question that acknowledged, rather than condemned, its intricate pain. He knew at last what he had to do. Inspector Pirbright's plan, when he unveiled it to Sergeant Love on Tuesday morning, seemed less like a piece of astute detective work and more like a social blunder of the highest order. "Tea, sir?" Love asked, his pen hovering over his notebook. "You want me to invite Lady Beaumont, Major and Mrs. Blundell, the town clerk, and Mr. Abernathy, for tea here?" "An informal gathering," Pirbright clarified, as if this made it perfectly normal. "Clarify one or two minor points in a more relaxed setting. Use the good biscuits, Sergeant." The result was a gathering in Pirbright's office that afternoon that had all the relaxed bonhomie of a ceasefire negotiation. The office itself, with its overflowing filing trays and a wilting pot plant, was not designed for society. Lady Eleanor sat stiffly on a wooden chair, radiating disapproval. Major Blundell stood by the window, inspecting the street outside as if looking for snipers. His wife, Beatrice, had positioned herself slightly apart, her expression one of cool, critical assessment. Mr. Finch wrung his hands, attempting to fill the silence with anxious pleasantries, while Silas Abernathy stood by the door, seemingly trying to make himself invisible. He was a small, weathered man in a tweed jacket that had seen better decades, his hands scrubbed raw from a lifetime of tending soil. He had not uttered a single word since arriving. Pirbright poured the tea himself, a slow, methodical process that only amplified the tension. "Thank you all for coming," he began, handing a cup to Lady Eleanor. "I won't keep you long. I simply wanted to walk through the few seconds of the commotion at the hall one last time, now that we've all had a chance to reflect." He proceeded to do just that, in a calm, almost monotonous voice, reciting the various contradictory statements. Mrs. Higgins's belief she was bumped, Lady Eleanor's feeling of a sharp pull, Mr. Finch's assertion of a general crush. He presented the facts with the detached air of a man reading a shipping forecast. The guests listened, their expressions ranging from boredom to irritation. Abernathy stared fixedly at a crack in the linoleum floor. "So you see the difficulty?" Pirbright concluded, placing his empty cup down with a soft click. "The exact mechanics of the locket's removal remain obscure." He paused, looking thoughtfully at the ceiling. "Of course, there is another factor we must consider. The locket itself?" He shifted his gaze to Lady Eleanor, his expression one of polite sympathy. "It is a well-known fact, my lady, that the clasp on your locket was, shall we say, notoriously unreliable. A rather beautiful but flawed Italian pattern, I'm told. You must have had trouble with it coming undone in the past." The lie, perfectly formed and delivered with absolute sincerity, hung in the air. For a moment, there was silence. Then, precisely as Pirbright had anticipated, Lady Eleanor's sense of pride overrode all other considerations. "Unreliable?" she snapped, her voice sharp with indignation. "Certainly not. My grandmother wore that locket for 50 years without incident. The clasp was as solid as a bank vault. The suggestion that it would simply fall off is preposterous." Major Blundell grunted in agreement. "Thing was built to last. Not like the flimsy rubbish they make these days." Beatrice Blundell's eyes, however, flickered with something else. A flicker of calculation. A faulty clasp would mean an accident, not a theft. An accident would mean no culprit, no scandal, and no satisfying downfall for her rival. Her face settled into a mask of disappointment. Mr. Finch merely looked confused, his mind trying to reconcile this new, contradictory piece of information with his desire for a simple resolution. Pirbright's gaze, however, was on Silas Abernathy. The gardener had not moved. He had not spoken. But at the mention of the faulty clasp, his head had lifted just an inch. His brow, for the briefest of moments, had furrowed in a look not of guilt or fear, but of profound, undeniable confusion. It was the look of a man who had held the object in his own hands and knew for a fact that what the inspector was saying was untrue. He had examined the locket, seen the strong, unbroken clasp, and his logical, practical mind could not square it with this new, official fact. The gesture was tiny, involuntary, and over in a second. But for Pubright, it was as loud and clear as a signed confession. "I see," the inspector said, his voice betraying nothing. "My apologies, Lady Eleanor. My information must have been incorrect." He stood up, signalling the end of the meeting. "Well, that has been most helpful. Thank you all for your time." He ushered them out, a strange collection of the town's elite, leaving a scent of expensive perfume, bewilderment, and damp tweed in their wake. When the door had closed, Sergeant Love turned to his superior, his face a perfect picture of incomprehension. "Sir," he said, "with all due respect, what on earth was the point of that?" "We learned absolutely nothing." Inspector Pubright walked over to his desk and picked up the evidence bag containing the single, withered marigold. "On the contrary, Sergeant," he said quietly, a faint smile touching his lips. "I think we've just learned everything." The following morning, Inspector Pubright did not summon Silas Abernathy to the station. Instead, he drove his Ford to the end of the terraced row of old railway cottages and walked up the narrow path to number 3. The garden was, as he had expected, a small miracle of precision and colour. Every plant was perfectly spaced, every border immaculately weeded. It was the territory of a man who found solace in absolute control. Abernathy answered the door himself, wiping his earthy hands on a piece of sackcloth. His face was a mask of wary resignation, as if he had been expecting this visit. He did not speak, merely stepped aside to let the inspector in. The cottage was as tidy as the garden, spare and clean, smelling of soap and damp soil. "Mr. Abernathy," Pubright began, his voice quiet, "your white perfection roses at the gala were truly magnificent. A lifetime of skill in that display. The compliment seemed to unbalance the gardener more than an accusation would have." A faint flush appeared on his weathered cheeks. "I know my roses, sir," he said, his voice low and raspy. "You do," Pubright agreed. "And I imagine you know your jewellery clasps, too." "A man with your eye for detail would." "Which is why you looked so confused yesterday in my office. When I mentioned the locket had a faulty clasp, everyone else in the room accepted it as a possibility, but you knew it was a lie. You knew because you had held the locket in your hand and seen for yourself that the Italian clasp was quite robust. The chain, however, had been snapped clean through." Abernathy sank onto a small wooden chair by the fireplace, his shoulders slumping. "He said nothing," Pubright continued, his tone not of a prosecutor, but of a man solving a difficult puzzle for his own satisfaction. "It was never a theft. That was the first mistake we all made. Lady Eleanor felt a tug, but it wasn't a thief's hand. In the crush, as Mrs. Higgins stumbled and the sherry fell, the chain of the locket must have snagged on a button. Major Blundell's tweed jacket, most likely. The chain broke and the locket fell silently to the floor. In all the commotion, no one noticed." He paused, looking directly at the gardener. "But you noticed. You were standing nearby. Perhaps you bent down to protect your rose display from the chaos. And there it was on the parquet floor. So you picked it up?" "My intention," Abernathy whispered, his eyes fixed on his own tightly clasped hands, "was to give it back." "I have no doubt of that," Pubright said calmly. "But the moment you held it in your hand, you were faced with an impossible choice. You, Silas Abernathy, the gardener who was publicly humiliated and dismissed from that very hall 15 years ago, were to walk up to Lady Eleanor Beaumont and hand her a piece of her family history. Can you imagine the scene? The suspicion? The condescending thanks from the woman who stood by and watched your career be destroyed over a fungus. The indignity of it all. coming at the very moment of your greatest triumph. Your pride, Mr. Abernathy, would not allow it. So you put the locket in your pocket to be returned later, anonymously. Abernathy nodded, a single, jerky movement. But the anger of that old injustice was still there. Pubright went on, and in that moment you performed a small act of rebellion. You reached into a nearby display, a garish thing full of common bedding plants, and you pulled out a single marigold. And you tucked it into the back of your own perfect, prize-winning display. It was a gesture no one else would understand. A vulgar orange flower to spoil the pure white perfection of the Beaumonts' favourite rose. A quiet, bitter little joke, just for you. The gardener finally looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. She never once looked at me. I won her society's highest prize, and she looked straight through me as if I were a ghost. Which brings us to the rose bowl, Pubright said, his voice softening further. You had the locket, but no way to return it without inviting the very humiliation you sought to avoid. So you devised a plan, a strange, convoluted plan born of profound social fear. You went to the town clerk's office on Saturday morning with everyone else, and when no one was looking, you simply picked up the trophy, your own trophy, and walked out with it. Your idea, I imagine, was to place the locket inside the bowl and leave it somewhere to be discovered. The locket would be returned, and no one would ever have to know you were involved. It was all out in the open now, the whole sad, tangled story. It was a crime born not of greed or malice, but of a deep, abiding terror of being shamed. You have caused a great deal of trouble, Mr. Abernathy, Pubright said, though there was no heat in his words. For Mrs. Higgins in particular. I never meant for that, Abernathy said, his voice thick with remorse. The poor woman, she was just clumsy. Once the police were called, and I heard them talking about her, I didn't know what to do. The more I thought, the deeper the hole I dug. There was a long silence in the small, tidy room. The items, Mr. Abernathy? Pubright asked at last. Without another word, the gardener rose, went to a small wooden sideboard, and opened a drawer. He brought out a velvet bag, the kind used for storing silver, and a small, soft cloth. From the bag, he carefully took the dented, silver-plated rose bowl, and from the cloth he unwrapped the crimson locket, its chain dangling broken from its side. He placed them both on the table between them, the evidence of his quiet, desperate folly. There was no arrest. There was no formal charge. Such legalistic simplicities were ill-suited to the intricate damage that had been done. Inspector Purbright's solution was one of quiet, carefully managed social repair. He left Silas Abernathy's cottage with the locket and the rose bowl, leaving behind him a man simultaneously burdened by remorse and liberated by confession. His next visit was to Hawthorn Hall. He was met by Lady Eleanor in the small study, the same room where she had first declared her heirlooms stolen. Pubright placed the locket, its broken chain coiled beside it, on the polished table. He then recounted the entire story, from the 15-year-old grievance to the misguided plan involving the trophy, omitting nothing. He did not soften the truth of her late husband's cruelty, nor did he excuse the gardener's foolishness. He presented it as a sad, closed circle of pride and humiliation. Lady Eleanor listened in absolute, rigid silence. Her first reaction was a flash of pure, aristocratic fury that a man like Abernathy would dare to touch her property, let alone use it in his private psychodrama. But, as Pubright spoke, another more complex expression settled on her face. Perhaps it was the memory of her husband's formidable temper, or perhaps it was the sheer inconvenience of a public court case that would expose the less-than-perfect history of the Beaumont name. Propriety, in the end, was a more powerful force than vengeance. "The church roof fund is in a lamentable state," she said at last, her voice brittle. "A significant anonymous donation would not go amiss, and a written apology delivered to me personally would suffice to close the matter." It was not forgiveness, but it was a conclusion, and so the official narrative of Chalmsbury was quietly re-edited. The Rose Bowl reappeared on Mr. Finch's credenza on Thursday morning, with a note attached, explaining it had been taken to a jeweller for a preliminary quote on the engraving and had been returned early. Mr. Finch, whose desire for a quiet life outweighed his curiosity, asked no questions. The story that circulated in the Windflower tea room was that the locket had been found, tangled in the lace of a tablecloth, by a cleaner. It was a disappointingly dull ending to what had promised to be a thrilling scandal, but the town accepted it and moved on to debating the council's controversial plan for a new car park. For Mrs. Millicent Higgins, the change was palpable. On Friday, as she was nervously buying soap, Beatrice Blundell gave her a brisk but not unkind nod. The following day, she received an invitation to a coffee morning. Her period of social exile was over, its end as unspoken and absolute as its beginning. At the police station, Sergeant Love finished typing the final report. The file was remarkably thin. It recorded the initial complaint, a list of persons interviewed, and the concluding line, "Locket recovered."
Case closed. The matter of the Rose Bowl was never officially a crime at all. It all just
stopped, Love said, tapping the file shut. Amazing, really.
All that fuss, and it just evaporated.
Inspector Pubright did not seem to be listening. He had a fresh sheet of paper in front of him and was carefully writing in his neat, deliberate script. The form was a standard one for larceny of a wheeled conveyance. A bicycle belonging to the butcher's boy had been stolen from outside the library. The boy was certain he knew who had taken it. There were no hidden motives, no symbolic gestures, no deep-seated wounds from a decade past. A boy wanted a bicycle he did not own, and so he had taken it. Pubright noted the make, the colour, and the location of the small patch of rust on the handlebars. He found the process deeply, wonderfully comforting. Paperwork, unlike people, did not have a fragile sense of pride. It did not nurse grievances or concoct elaborate schemes to avoid embarrassment. It was simple, logical, and it yielded to the steady, methodical application of procedure. It was business as usual, thank you, have a nice day. The end.